as someone that's more or like less interested or just I don't know, less talented in math, I find mastering math concepts really hard. So how like what's your strategies or what's your framework on mastering those concepts? Because your content definitely spans over so many fields, right? Like machine learning or math in general. Yeah, so I was just curious how you master those.
Yeah, so first of all, I mean the framing of it's very easy to kind of think of there being like, oh, some people are good at math or talented at math, and like some have it and don't. I really do think it's just a matter of time spent on it. But the answer to your question would be like, what does it look like for it to be productive time? I think that it's really easy to accidentally find yourself just watching videos or just like reading notes or watching lectures and not really solving problems. And this is maybe a cliched thing. It's like, oh, you've got to actively do like practice and solve problems, but it really does matter for like building up your intuitions, where there's these sort of ineffable patterns that when you come to understand something else, it's because you came to recognize a pattern in the service of like solving something else. And I actually think computer science and like building things ends up being a really good ground for solving those kinds of problems. Like I'll give you an example actually here, which is I um, was recently working on a video about like the unsolvability of the quintic, which is this result about how we've got like a quadratic formula and a little bit lesser known cubic formula, and then a god awful quartic formula to solve degree 4 polynomials. But you actually can never have a quintic formula. And this like interesting reason why. And in the service of creating like an illustration for this, there was one, basically I needed a little program. I could even like pull it up now potentially, but like a program where you actually, I will do that because rather than waving my hands, can I share my screen? Well, if a host enables me to share my screen or something, but where you can tweak around the coefficients of a polynomial and then see what happens to its roots. And the whole explanation ends up centering on like ways that those roots get shuffled as you like move around your coefficients. Now, this was all just like in the service of explaining one thing, and I was coming to better understand that one thing, but just to implement that tool required just a good way to like go from the coefficients of a polynomial to the roots. I'm like, oh, well, given that it's unsolvable and like some constraints into the word unsolvable, like what's the way to do this? And there's a bunch of other root finding methods. And one that you might learn about in calculus is something called Newton's method. And I basically just ended up in this rabbit hole of like, I sort of thought that like Newton's method is like simple and like, oh, it's this thing that kind of gets you closer to roots. But it's this really, really interesting rabbit hole if you let yourself go into it. And it was only in the service of like building something for it. And then I was like, oh, maybe I'll do a video about Newton's method and like the fractals that come about from it and like trying to explain some of that. And like the effort of trying to explain it and the effort of like building things around it just felt like a much more productive use of time than merely reading about it. It was like with this product end goal. And so if you find yourself like wanting to learn something, and the first thing might be to ask like, why is it that you want to learn it? And because if it's in the service of building something, like outstanding, that's actually a good way to maybe learn it a little bit more deeply. And if it's not in the service of building something, and you are like, you know, a hacker as part of being a member of this club, I assume, ask yourself if there is something that you can build in the service of like understanding it or explaining it to others or like justifying to yourself that it is kind of a useful thing. Not all math fits into that. Like sometimes you do just kind of want to drill on it. Like if you're learning calculus, there should be some point when you just like try to compute a whole bunch of integrals and you're not necessarily building something, but well, you're building your own intuitions about them. But it's like there is a time when you have to do that. And like even research level mathematicians like spend their time drilling on stuff to learn the new things they need to for their research. So like there's never a point when you're above that. But in the times when you can build, I actually think that that's when it sinks in and you like remember it for years thereafter.